Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Switch. My name is Patty Hampton and you're in for a real treat. Today's topic is all about talent attraction and diversity recruitment practices in nonprofits. Did you know that the nonprofit HR brand ecosystem has exclusively focused on the talent management needs of the social sector, including nonprofits and social enterprises, for more than 20 years? In this episode, you'll hear from several nonprofit experts, including Myra Briggs, Managing Director of Search, Emily Holthouse, Managing Director, DEI, Lisa McEwen, Managing Director, Total Rewards, Sophia LaFontant, Search Consultant, and Dr. Antonio Cortes, DEI Senior Consultant. Listen in as they share best practices for attracting diverse talent, discuss challenges many organizations face in this core area of talent management, and so much more. Share this production in your communities and download the slides and transcripts. You can visit www.nonprofithr.com/The Switch. You'll get a video recording, presentation slides, and other assets. Without further ado, here are your panel experts.
Everyone, welcome to the conversation today. We are excited to host a discussion that we hope will be interactive, informative, but also I like to call it, we're going to have some real talk today about bias and how it potentially creeps into our systems and processes related to HR, specifically with attraction of talent and interviewing and onboarding. And so I have a really awesome panel with me here today. And as we jump into the conversation, the first time they speak, they're going to just introduce themselves a little bit to you. As Alicia stated, my name is Emily Holthouse, and I am really excited and jazzed up to begin the conversation.
This event was originally recorded as a nonprofit HR webinar. Check out other nonprofit HR events and virtual learning opportunities at nonprofithr.com/events.
This whole idea of bias within systems, we know is real. And I think I've worked with hundreds of organizations across the country, and I have not yet met one that hasn't had bias creeping into their systems around HR. It's just a place in organizations where we see it popping up and happening. And so my first question to the team for this afternoon is this idea of how do organizations go about beginning to identify where bias might be creeping into their practices? And so, Myra, I'm hoping you might be able to kick us off with that question today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Emily. My name is Myra Briggs, just as a reintroduction, and I am the practice leader of our search practice here at Nonprofit HR. And one of the things that I think leadership should think about when looking for places where biases are creeping up is really just open your eyes and think about where and if everyone across your organization is being treated fairly and equitably. You want to ask questions. You want to immediately ask questions around, do people feel that they have a fair chance for promotions within? You want to find out if members of your team believe that they feel well represented on the leadership team. You want to talk to your staff and address what you're hearing. The biggest issue that I think most of us come across when we're dealing with issues around biases is that we're afraid to acknowledge that they're there. And the fear of acknowledging that they're there really does come from a place of not ever wanting to be labeled a bigot, not ever wanting to be labeled a person who promotes inequity in the workplace. But the problem with that is that without identifying it, you'll never ever be able to actually work on the issues and begin to create the environment that we most often hope for within our organization. So I think the best piece of advice that I could give is to open your eyes and acknowledge what you're actually seeing. If you're looking around your boardroom table and you only see one colored face, we have a problem. If you're looking at around your leadership team table and you only see one colored face, you only see a face that is represented by one gender or one other specific cultural background, we have a problem. If we can go across the organization and everyone is going to the same exact homecoming each year because we're only recruiting from the same school, that's another problem that we might have. And these are some things that don't even really require a full assessment of your systems to see or even to be able to identify. So start there. Just open your eyes, take a look around, and start in the places where you see huge groupings of just one thing and figure out how did we get here and how can we mix it up a bit.
Yeah. And Antonio, I wonder if you can jump in a little bit to say, okay, we've got there. We know that bias exists. We've listened to our team members that are sharing their experiences that may be showing up in a way that is not what we're intending in an organization. You know, what other tactical ways can organizations really say, let's understand where our starting point is, which I believe you have to do in order to be able to set targets to move or transform your organization?
Definitely. There's a lot of things that organizations can do. And I apologize. So I'm Antonio Cortes, the Senior Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Consultant at Nonprofit HR. And so, organizations can do a variety of things, even if you have the ability from an HR standpoint, just to look at your own metrics internally, looking at pay, looking at distribution of positions across the organization and who holds them. You can actually just look at hard data to see, well, what's going on here? Am I actually fostering a diverse staff group? And then how does that actually look across the spectrum of the hierarchy of staff from frontline all the way up to senior leadership and even the board. The board is a very important piece of that assessment too. And understanding, okay, well, if I have a diverse mix of staff, let's just say that happened either on purpose or by accident, are they equitably distributed across the organization? And one easy way to look at this is if you look at national demographics, you can look at census data to get a sense of who lives in this country currently. And what you'll find a lot of times is that a lot of organizations don't really mirror the communities that they're in, that they're working in, and they definitely don't mirror national demographics of diversity either. So really looking at your actual organizational information is another great area that you can do on your own, even without any consultant's help. But that also leads into another area where getting another set of eyes in your organization is also a phenomenal way to really uncover things that you might accidentally or unknowingly be biased about. And I think that's another area that we can definitely help with too. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Yeah, thanks. And I think also too, the accountability to this is different now than it ever has been, right? As we think about what's happening in our world and if we're watching the news and seeing everything going on, and organizations are going to be held more accountable to. I love that you talked about who leads our organization. Is that reflective of the communities or constituents that we're serving? And is there a disconnect there or not? And Sophia, I'm wondering if you can weigh in a little bit too, what do you say to organizations that are really trying to figure this out and figure out where bias might be creeping in?
I would say that for a person who might be more practical and you just want to sit and identify within yourself, because I always think that self-introspective is important. There are biasy tests that you can just sit and take at your own, right? And you can see, how do I normally approach these interviews as a recruiter, or how am I serving in a supervisory role if I already have biases within me? There's also that point of taking on some own accountability, maybe doing some research. You can read books. There are many videos and webinars today, but there's also your own research that you can do without having to go to your colleagues and ask them, well, what do we do now? Or am I wrong when I think this? Or how do I say this? We're in a day and age where information is literally at your fingertips. And if you do have a question about something, take a look at yourself as well and see what role you can play in making a change on a daily basis.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to take us kind of back to the beginning, because people oftentimes will struggle with leadership diversity and getting people into their organization. And oftentimes that starts way back about, what does your employment brand say about you? And if I, had a dollar for every time someone told me, Emily, no diverse staff apply, or we can't find diverse staff. But at the end of the day, it starts kind of really farther up of, in this day and age, before people even apply to your organization, they're going to Google you. They're going to go on Glassdoor and see what people are saying. They're going to look at your website, right? And so I want us to talk a little bit there. So Myra, I'm going to ask you this one. So when organizations are developing their employment brand, what do you believe is most important for them to consider as it relates to equity and inclusion and who they're attracting?
The first thing I would say is start now. Don't wait for this plan to be fully baked. Don't wait for a number of testimonials that you can put out there to prove that you have a diverse and equitable workplace, you need to start now and be honest about where you are and be honest about the fact that you have aspirations to be a more equitable organization, especially if there are things out in the media or in the marketplace that say otherwise. However, if there isn't anything out there that says otherwise, it's even easier to start now because you don't really even have to undo a perception. What you really have to do is be an evangelist for the culture that you hope to create from the podium that you have as a leader within your organization, and begin to preach, so to speak, what it is that you hope for that branding to become. And one of the things that I tell clients when we're going through this is that the very first person that you hire under this new sort of world order, they don't know anything different within your organization. So now you've got one person who has already bought into the new culture that you're trying to set. The next person that you hire, you bring them in, and now you've got two people that have already bought into and don't have to undo the culture. And if you continue over time to evangelize from the podium, so to speak, I learned that from a very good friend, that you will eventually create, along with the intentional steps, Antonio made an amazing point, that you do need to bring in an external consultant to take a look at what steps you really need to be making to make what you're preaching the truth. But while you are working internally to create that type of culture, you have to start now. You really have to begin taking the steps to create that diverse and equitable workplace. And a lot of organizations, I think, try to wait until the process has been fully baked. They try to wait until the consultancy has completed and we have the professional recommendations. All of those things are coming, but you should not be waiting for that final deliverable before you actually begin to change and undergird your viewing out in the marketplace as a fair and equitable employer. And so if I have anything to say, it is start now. You make the decision today, and everything that you should be doing from now on should be speaking to that. And you should be working with your marketing team and interweaving DEI into every conversation. The lens should be on, that's why we call it a DEI lens, because you really should see every single thing that you're looking at on behalf of your organization through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and your branding will follow.
Yeah, and I'm going to also kind of back up to something you said at the very beginning there, which is this idea that what you say must align with what you do, right? And so employment brand can't just be a statement out there and some good photos on the website, because people will expose the fact if there is that disconnect. And so I would love to hear either Antonio or Sophia, whoever wants to jump in, just, what are some things that organizations can do to avoid having that disconnect with their employment brand?
Yeah, I can chime in here. So one of the things that I think an eager organization does, and they kind of get ahead of themselves sometimes, is they recognize that there's a call for action, and then they take action without really thinking about the ramifications of it. So as an example, maybe I adopt a diversity and inclusion statement as an organization, but I haven't really circulated and socialized it internally, but it's now public. That's potentially a big disconnect, because now the employees that actually work in the organization may not be familiar with it. They may not necessarily understand or even agree with it if they weren't part of the process of crafting it. So I think, to make sure that there's not disconnects, you have to make sure that you've done the work internally in the organization to actually begin to foster a culture that allows diversity to thrive. And even if I brought in 100 diverse candidates to apply to an organization, if the organization isn't ready to accommodate what that means practically, they may come, they may decide to drop out of the process, or they may decide to stay for a little bit and then they might leave shortly after. So we want to make sure that we're setting up organizations for success, so that way they can both attract and retain diverse staff and maximize the value that they are able to obtain from that.
You have been listening to The Switch, a nonprofit HR podcast on powering your people with talent management insights, best practices, and hacks. Looking for a thought partner to help you integrate talent into your mission's strategic plan? Well, the good news is Nonprofit HR has solutions to meet your unique talent management needs. Strategic planning is an annual ritual for many nonprofits. Yet, countless organizations plan for programs and fundraising without thinking about the talent needed to meet those goals and ultimately their mission. With more than 20 years of expertise under our belt and the bench strength of credentialed consultants, We partner with all mission types and offer solutions that span project-based human resources consulting and outsourcing, search, total rewards, and DEI. Join the community of social impact organizations that have trusted nonprofit HR to help them achieve their full potential through their people.
Yeah, and I think you talked about value, right? And all of us in the HR space know that, that idea of the cost to an organization when someone comes in, stays for a short time and leaves, and then we have to go back to the beginning and start again. So there definitely is sort of that business case for doing a good job on the front end to make sure you're representing your organization well, getting diverse candidates in, and then, like you said, having that environment where folks will stay with the organization and feel like they're included and belonging. So Sophia, what have you seen that works for organization that helps them to make a good impression with new and potential leaders coming in?
So for me, from the recruitment perspective, it's like immediately jumping in with the job posting, like how the language that you use in that job posting is something that a new employee is going to see before they even get the opportunity to meet you, and what would make them want to apply. You want to make the language be inclusive. You don't want it to sound very gendered. Using like verbs of ambitious or guru can take a certain demographic to not feel comfortable wanting to apply for the role. I think a lot of people stray away from including salary, but thinking about what Antonio said about, and what everyone has kind of said, Myra, even in saying like practice what you preach and then being inclusive about what you do on the inside, including salary in that job description actually gives that transparency and shows for you as an employer that you're intending to make sure that your pay equity within your organization also matches what you announce outside to new employees. So if you're staying away from including the salary because you know that what you're paying new employees may not match what you're already paying current employees, that is a reflection that you should look back on yourself and say, okay, maybe our pay equity isn't matching, because with these new initiatives that we have, I'm thinking I need to pay differently. But you also have to make sure that the new individuals that you are bringing in also align with what you currently have going on. So if that means looking back at your pay equity system within so that you can actually be inclusive on the outside, then that's something you should do as well.
Yeah, and Sophia, I'm glad that you talked about just having job descriptions that using the equity lens there. And I talked to a lot of nonprofit organizations specifically where in all of their job descriptions, they require a 4-year degree. And I say, why? Why is that required? Is that required to actually do the job? Because things like 4-year degree requirements for every full-time position potentially creates a barrier for individuals in the community that could do a really great job doing XYZ, but maybe don't meet that requirement. And sometimes eliminating those within job descriptions, if they're not necessary, helps open up a whole different pool of candidates that wouldn't even have looked to apply to your organization before. So there's a lot of things like that within, posting a job specifically, or how you talk about the opportunity that helps it to be more equitable and open for everyone. And so Myra, you're shaking your head. I don't know if you have any other examples of what groups do.
When it comes to the question of pay equity around what Sophia said, posting the salaries is a fantastic way of doing that and maintaining just that. It's transparency that people are really looking for when it comes to pay equity, and I think that posting the salaries is a perfect way of getting around that. But more than anything, I think if we go back to the first answer that we gave in the conversation, we talked a bit about the leadership in an organization looking more like the constituents that, especially a nonprofit, is serving. And I think that there's no better employer branding than for you to be an organization with a mission that more often than not serve a certain demographic of people, and for people to be able to look internal to your organization and see that the constituency that is being served is also represented at every level throughout the organization, from the service delivery through executive level and all of the rest of those things. And I would really seriously encourage, I'm saying more and more organizations, especially when they come to us for executive search, making that request with that as the reason for backup. And I think there's no better reason than to hire in that way. And I think that I would make the plea now for more organizations to take a look at, what does your service delivery team look like? What does your leadership team look like? What is the programmatic leadership that is actually developing programming that is supposed to advance your mission? What walk of life are these people coming from? And are they going to be able to connect with the actual needs of the constituents that you're hoping to serve. And at the end of the day, as mission-focused organizations, that's really what we're doing. We want to serve a specified demographic of people. And I think that's one of the best ways to advance the mission and honestly to brand yourselves as an equitable employer.
Yeah, thank you. And Alicia, I know you're popping in. That means we've got some questions from the audience. So we'll let you throw those out.
We have a lot of good questions, but I was going to focus on some that relate to what Sophia said about job descriptions and language. So a couple of people one person asked if you could say more about keywords or phrases that exclude certain groups. And related to that, somebody asked about, you mentioned guru and ambitious as words to stay away from. So why are they bad? And what are the other words to be cautious of?
So ambitious and guru are definitely gender words that lean more toward a masculine area where it can drive women away from wanting to apply to that role. Also, in what Emily was saying about having the nice to haves listed on your job description versus the must have. So that 4-year degree, that's a nice to have. It would be wonderful if everyone had a 4-year degree, but that does not take away from the actual skill set and experience that a person has. So in those cases, more neutral language would be for your nice to haves or things that are not must haves. You might want to say be familiar with. It's not a requirement that a person is familiar with a certain software or a requirement that they're familiar with a certain law, like maybe it's employment law or something. That is also something that they could learn on the job. If we're saying that this is not a executive role and this is an entry-level role, there are certain things that don't have to be on that must-have and therefore shouldn't be included in the job description, deterring a certain community of people who may not have that exact expertise. Because that's the other thing, is when you include something for women, they apply based on, I am an expert in this. When we know that men demographically apply when they know 40% of what is included on the job description. 40%, boom, I'm ready to apply. For a woman, they're looking to know 85 to 100% of what is on this job description before they even put their name in. So you want to make sure that you're really including things that are not going to limit a certain demographic based on the studies that are already out there, the information that shows you how women apply in difference to how men apply to roles. So if you want to get more women to apply, you need to make the job description something that a woman would be interested in applying to.
I'm sorry, I was just going to ask, which is kind of a follow-up, if there are any resources that you all could recommend where people might find some information on this.
Well, that is a great question, and this is unfortunately the difficult answer that I'll give. So my background, I'm a PhD business psychologist and industrial organizational psychologist as well, and I went to graduate school to basically revise job descriptions to make them look more equitable on the surface, so that we were attracting a more diverse clientele. And the reality is this isn't really a space that you can kind of self-learn. Formal kind of rethinking of how job descriptions are formulated is typically a role of a subject matter expert. And that's my personal perspective, recognizing that I am one of those big experts, so to speak, right? If you're looking for statistics help, you want someone that's experienced with statistics. So it's an expertise skill. And yeah, you can definitely find information on Google, right? You can do a web search and you can find information that can kind of help you start that process of looking at easy things like gendered words as an example and start to pick those back. But really looking at the structure of the job, you want to really get into understanding what is required for someone to successfully perform this role. What's a bona fide occupation qualification? A lot of times a bachelor's degree is not required because the bachelor's degree in very rare instances provides anything more than generalized higher level education. And I can tell you with a bachelor's degree in psychology, I couldn't do much. I had to continue on further and get some more experience and such. So when I'm looking at selection for a person, I want to make sure that the job description actually says, what do you have to be able to do, what you have to know to perform this job at a bare minimum, and then everything else is kind of the nice to have, as Sophia was saying.
And I would think, and I'm thinking about too, like, so what organizations can do now right away. If you have employee resource groups, have your employee resource groups take a look at your job descriptions and get some feedback from them. Ask diverse constituents inside your organization to look and identify for you what might not be working. I think you probably have people in your own organization today with diverse perspectives that can give you some advice on what to do and how to change them and how to make them more inclusive. And if you don't yet have employee resource groups within your staff teams, reach out to team members that you know and trust that are going to be willing willing to give you some feedback around how to make your postings more something that people can connect to, how to make your job descriptions more equitable. Those are like small things that all organizations can do, right? And I think when you do something in a vacuum and one or two people are doing it, that in itself introduces bias. When you're not having diverse opinions, it's part of your process of creating systems, creating job descriptions, creating all of that. So anything you can do as an organization to just expand whose eyes are on it and whose brains are contributing to it is going to help reduce bias for you as well. So I think that's something that anyone can do in this space. And I do want us to focus for a second on this idea of, okay, we have a good employment brand. We've written our job descriptions right. We've attracted the right talent pools to our organization. Now we're bringing them into the interview process. And I also know that interview processes can be places where bias is all over them, from things like, the studies around resumes and names that sound a certain way and how they're sorted in or out, things like that. So I want you all to just weigh in now on just the hiring process. What advice do you give to organizations around creating equity within their hiring process? And whoever would like to jump in first.
I'll just add, so I'm a fan of interview panels that are a representation of the organization's diversity as well as different levels of expertise. So not all of the leadership team or the executive staff needs to be on that panel. You should have some individuals that will be peers or colleagues of the individual who is interviewing, and also make sure that the representation of those individuals have different educational backgrounds, different demographics, of course, that you see visually, but also coming from. So it's more than just what you see in a person, but it's also about, how did a person grow up? What school did they go to? Make sure that the schools are different, right? The background of your panel members is actually different. So I'm a fan of that for hiring processes, as well as being mindful of including, even if it's at your second interview or your third round interview, including benefit information that will let a person who is interviewing know that you are flexible, that you already have a plan in place that prioritizes work-life balance, be it maternity leave or be it a flexible schedule of when you may log in or show up to work. Maybe you can log in as early as 7 a.m. or come in as late as 10 a.m. and just make sure that there are like specific core hours for, being able to interface with each other. May it be from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. But being able to speak forward immediately about that in the hiring process, I think is very important to getting diverse individuals interested in your roles.
You're listening to The Switch. Follow along with this podcast. Download the slides and other visual materials at nonprofithr.com/The Switch.
I am always shocked by how many organizations will allow people to be hired by only being interviewed by one person in the organization, right? And when, again, you're limiting someone's ability to be able to be fully objective or to not allow their personal biases to impact who they're choosing. And, we as individuals, we look at affinity. And if you think about who you pull closest to you, as humans, we always pull people closest to us who identify closely to us with dimensions of diversity. So the panel approach is incredibly important to make sure that you've got those diverse mindsets at the table as you're bringing candidates in. So Myra, what else? You're shaking your head. What else needs to happen here around interviewing?
Interview questions the same questions must be asked of each candidate. Is very, very important. You have to come up with a list of questions. Obviously, you can't really gauge supplemental questions, probing questions that you ask to dig deeper on an answer, but the general format of the interview should be the same, with the same questions for each candidate, to ensure that you really are comparing apples to apples. And it also does eliminate bias. Because of our affinities, we can very easily go down rabbit holes with candidates that we immediately make a connection with, and we may not even cover things. And they're our pick before we've even covered anything that's really essential to the role. But I would say, more than anything, above all else, the easiest thing would be same interview questions. And then also being very thoughtful about a debrief whenever possible. If you can get everyone that interviewed, if there's 30 people, you might have to break it up, right? But if you've got a group of 10 or less that have participated in the interview process, get everyone together to discuss the groups of candidates, because that's the best way that you're going to be able to come up with common themes. That's the best way that you're going to be able to come up with any biases, because that's where things are going to pop up as red flags, where everyone at the table is going to look, I didn't see that at all. I don't understand. And we can really begin to, in a safe environment, talk each other through those biases to say, I didn't see that at all. Let's talk through why you saw that, how you got to that place. And more than anything, it's about checks and balances, making sure that none of these decisions are made in a bubble, that everyone is holding each other accountable to what we really said was essential for the role, and everyone having conversations. And then just a personal pet peeve of mine is no lobbying outside of the group of interviewers. If there are 5 people that are interviewing, there should not be 2 or 3 people on the side talking about what happened during the interview and how we're going to get together to get a candidate pushed over or whatever the case is. There should be no lobbying. All conversations about the interview should take place in a controlled environment where the entire interview panel is there, so that there's no other opportunity for bias to creep in.
Yeah,
Yep.
I love that. Antonio, what do you say?
Yeah, and Myra had some great points, and I want to build on them. So in addition to having structured interviews, which are fairly easy to do, right? I think most organizations
Absolutely.
can create those on their own if they want to, but also having formalized evaluation scales to go along with those structured questions. So, formally in my field, we call them BARs, behaviorally anchored rating scales, but really they're just saying, okay, well, how did this person respond to this question? Did they provide great detail? Did they answer the question directly? Do they actually have the knowledge base? There's ways to kind of even out the evaluation of even the responses to those questions, so that way you can actually have some quantitative data to look at across your interview panel if you're able to have a panel, and then compare scores. And that actually makes decision making on, did this person answer the question well? Did they answer it fully? More objective, which is a phenomenal way to reduce the amount of bias that could potentially creep into the process.
Yeah, I love it. And that brings me to this question that I have about the word fit, right? And in the interview process, we don't often have sort of the rubric or the data. So panels end up talking about fit and how that person fits into the organization. And so, any advice for organizations to just sort of get past that idea of we want what we've always had, and that fit question is sort of code for, are you really going to fit in with sort of how we have always done things, which may or may not drive equity. So Antonio, I'm going to go back to you for a second. What do you say about that?
Definitely. I feel like fit, historically, it may have been viewed very positively. It's like, oh, this person fits well within our organization and our culture. But the reality is today, with the diversity of people that live and work in the US and everywhere else, actually, you want complement or addition to culture and organization operations, right? You want someone to bring new skills to the organization. You want them to bring new perspectives. So as an example, if I came into an organization that never had someone of my expertise come in, you would never have someone that had my expertise, because you're looking for fit. You're not looking for complement to an organization's operations and skill set. So you really want to kind of reverse the viewing of how you think about fit, and really look to find people that will bring more to your organization to help you grow.
And I would say even bring individuals in that will push the status quo, right? And, I love to bring people in that are going to blow up some things and blow up my perspective a little bit and help me grow and move, right? And that idea of depending on fit all the time, and fit is also so intangible. Like, what does that even mean? When someone says that to me, I was like, well, you need to help me understand, like, what does that even mean in your organization? Sophia, you're smiling. Any other advice for organizations around the word fit or the concept of fit?
So I'm smiling because I'm laughing at an interview that I went on years ago, not many years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago. And they actually said, we want you to fit into this organization with us. It was a team of 4 people. And this is when I used to travel a lot for recruiting. So I was still looking for another job where I could travel all the time. And they were like, so since we all travel together, we want to make sure that, because I'm planning my wedding, this is like the verbatim their word, I'm planning my wedding and she just got engaged and one of us just had a baby. We want to make sure that you're going to feel comfortable and you're going to fit with us and you can help us plan the wedding and do the engagement party stuff. And I was like, this, in my mind, this is not a part of the job description, but you are being very sincere. They even asked me if I was a Disney character, what Disney character would I want to be? Because based on that response, it was going to let them know whether or not, like, do I fit the princesses, I guess, that fit in their like party? Like if they chose Cinderella, with Sleeping Beauty want to come to the party. And I understood it from a recruiting perspective that this was a very unhealthy, not professional traditional interview. These were not great questions to ask, but that was what was important to them because they were looking for fit. They weren't concerned with the actual skills that were brought to the table, the complimenting or whether or not I would push the envelope. They wanted to make sure that the camaraderie, the happy hours and whatever it was they already had going just stayed exactly the same and sustained. And maybe even I would think they were looking to replace the other person who had left the role. So they may have wanted, because they wanted a fit, right? They may have wanted me to sound just like the person who had left, who I don't know. So I wouldn't know how to make my sound like the other fourth member of your team who had just left. And so when I think about fit, I think about trying to make a person be an exact puzzle piece. And that's not really possible if we all didn't come from the same manufacturer. We aren't a part of the same previous company. You're asking someone to be something or do something that isn't possible for them to attain. And the way to go about that would, again, be very much covered in bias, because you would have to take your previous coworker and say, can you send me one of your friends who has the same previous skill set and experience that you have? That way she can replace you. And that would not be healthy either, because now you're only getting the same circle of people being the referrals for roles. So that is why I was smiling when I was thinking of that. But to give something to counteract being a fit, I think it's also necessary to say if we have new initiatives. So right now we're thinking about things from a DEI perspective. If we have new DEI lens and a new initiative, even if it's not a DEI, but if we have any new initiatives that we're accomplishing, let's bring in someone who can help us push those initiatives, because we have some new things that we want to do, and let's be transparent about talking to them about those new things and see what they can add to that, because we're currently trying to change or grow our culture. So I think that would be a better way to think about, can a person fit?
All right. Well, I have one more question based on what you said, and then we'll let Alicia jump in a second. But you touched on something. You said referrals and referrals from networks. And I think a lot of you maybe have systems in place around bringing talent into your organization based on your current employee referrals, right? And that is a great way to find talent, but it potentially can be an inhibitor of you finding diverse talent. And so anybody want to weigh in on that a little bit? Antonio, I see you shaking your head. Would you weigh in on that part a little bit?
Definitely. I remember early on in my career, someone was talking to me about, them and their entire team all went to the same school, and they saw it as a very positive thing. And it can be, right? Having a lot of kind of foundational things in common with somebody. But the issue with that is different institutions, as an example, approach various topics in a different way. So if I went to get my MBA from Purdue versus IU or another school somewhere around the country or another part of the world, the approach to education is different. So what you leave that institution with is also very different. And that's what we want to try to draw from a lot of different places, because then that allows you to attack different organizational and social issues in different ways, because you have a different kind of approach and a mindset to handle these questions. And that becomes really beneficial to an organization when they're trying to deal with complex and difficult issues that many of us deal with, social issues, right? And so to have more brains at the table, to have different ideas, it's essential that we're not pulling from the same pool over and over again. We want to diversify where we're pulling from.
Yeah, and I think organizations that struggle with diversity, especially at the tops of their organizations, and then they double down on the referral piece, it really is sort of spinning yourself in that same cycle, and it will take you to have some additional strategies to sort of break you out of that, because we're going to recruit people that are in our circles, which by default are often people that are most like us, either from differing dimensions of diversity related to physical things or location things, but also schools of thought is what you're talking about, and that's the same kind of cycle. So figuring out other ways to be able to attract diverse talent is really important. So Alicia, what do we have from the audience?
Yeah, we have two people asking about if you recommend blind resumes.
I would not recommend blind resumes in the beginning. I think that that's the answer to a problem. I don't think that you need to start out. I think you want to have a bit of faith in your team that you can put a resume in front of them with a name on it and do some training around bias before you just send blind resumes. Again, it can be an answer to a problem. If you do have issues around equity, and I've not previously had to do blind resumes with names at a certain level, but I have had to remove, like Antonio said, I've had to remove the names of schools from resumes before, where I've put the degree that they have because that was a requirement for the position, but took away the name of the school, mainly because around that I've seen people that will recruit specifically from certain programs, or you will see that people shy away from, say, for-profit universities and different things like that. And you want to make sure that you can eliminate those types of biases. But if those types of biases are popping up, I think we want to ask some additional questions around what are you looking for here, right? Biases develop for a reason because people have had a certain experience with a certain person or a group of people or in a certain situation. And as a result, they have developed an overarching opinion about every single person, thing, or whatever that fits that demographic, right? So when we're talking about resumes, if there's a name that draws attention or people are shying away from, if there is a school that or a program that draws attention or people are shying away from, before just wiping it, it's a great opportunity from the recruiter's perspective, to find out what you're driving at by wanting people that come from a specific program at a specific school, right? Because there's something about the work ethic, there's something that they're teaching at the school, there's something about the difficulty of getting in the school that you're not able to pinpoint with real qualifications and competencies. So as a recruiter, it's my job to dig in there with you and say, okay, when you see this, what are you actually seeing? So that now I can present you with that and remove the bias because you're getting what you actually want. And so I'd say it's an answer to a problem. It fixes a problem, but I wouldn't start there because you automatically put people on the defense, and that's a horrible place to start from if you're really trying to manage an equitable hiring process.
You have been listening to The Switch, a nonprofit HR podcast on powering your people with talent management insights, best practices, and hacks. Looking for a thought partner to help you integrate talent into your mission strategic plan? Well, the good news is Nonprofit HR has solutions to meet your unique talent management needs. Strategic planning is an annual ritual for many nonprofits, yet countless organizations plan for programs and fundraising without thinking about the talent needed to meet those goals and ultimately their mission. With more than 20 years of expertise under our belt and the bench strength of credentialed consultants, we partner with all mission types and offer solutions that span project-based human resources, consulting and outsourcing, search, total rewards, and DEI. Join the community of social impact organizations that have trusted nonprofit HR to help them achieve their full potential through their people.
And Myra, on the other side of that, I have seen that technique work at times in organizations where they know that they have sort of very specific roadblocks that have been occurring for candidates to even move on from a first round into a second round. And so I'm not going to say don't ever do that, because there are plenty of studies out there that tell us that people with more African-American sounding names or ethnic sounding names, potentially with identical resumes as people that don't. And I kind of smile about it because this is my personal story too, right? So my name's Emily, and when you see my resume, you might think certain things about me based on my name, right? And my husband's German, so I have a German last name. My first name is Emily, and I have a German last name. And so I've had times where I've gone into interviews where I'm sitting waiting, and they're like, Emily, we're looking for Emily, and I was like, I'm right here, because they didn't expect me to be Emily, right? And I think in my mind, that's sort of a privilege that I have based on, the name I was given, right? And it works the other way too. And so I think it's a technique, a tactic if you know that that's a challenge in your organization, but it probably isn't the first place that you should start. So Antonio or Sophia, I don't know if either of you have a perspective on that at all.
I definitely can't hide with my name. You kind of see you kind of know what you're going to get there. But from a standpoint of that's an issue, right? We know it's an issue because it's been documented in research. I remember I had an intern who was Chinese, and she was here in the States doing her graduate work, and they're basically socialized to not use their given names. They're basically allowed to kind of have their fake name. So she always forced me to call her Christy when her actual name was Yulin, because she was fearful of how people would view her just because of her name. And so we have to recognize that this is an issue, and we're socialized in various ways to get to this point. But just kind of removing it doesn't remove the entire issue. And I think that's really what Myra's trying to get at is, you can do that, but there's still going to be other layers of issues that won't be addressed by taking that strategy. But it can definitely help certain organizations at least advance past one issue.
Yeah. And then just also take into account the advancing through the interview process. With our previous recruitment job, we always did blind assessments. So after you went through the initial screening and it was time for the interview process, there was an assessment that was sent out. When the assessments were returned, as a recruiter, I did not give the assessment with a name on it, so that when you now went to the interview panel to be interviewed, every person was just interviewing those individuals and selecting who they wanted to interview based off what they answered on the assessment, and not necessarily based on, oh, well, it didn't match this resume. I was already interested in him because he came from the college that I went to. So let me tell Sophia, yes, I want to interview this person. It's kind of like you have to choose who you want to interview in the second round based off, one, the recommendations I gave from the screening, and your second criterion is going to be the assessment. So you're going to end up getting the person who actually fits for the role, and that will not fit in what we talked about before, but the person who actually goes with the skill set and can bring to your organization what you want. And then from there, they were able to get resumes. So after they made the assessments, then I was like, okay, well, here's the resumes that go with the assessments. And then that's how we move forward.
That's it. That's an interesting way to go about it too, in the middle, to kind of remove that. And I think for those of you on the call, I know a lot of you are in charge of hiring in your organizations, right? And so thinking about you and yourself as a leader, and Myra talked about understanding where you personally might have some biases. And I would, again, encourage you to think about what are some ways, as you evaluate how you currently go through an interview process in your organization, what types of things can you do? And I remember when I was doing a lot of hiring in my career, and anytime we had a set of panel interviews that needed to be done, any of the team members that I recruited to sit on that panel, I would have them, like a day or two before, go to the Harvard implicit bias site and take a couple of the implicit bias little e-tests that you can take. And not because I wanted them to share with me what they learned, but it's this idea of getting your biases to the forefront of your mind before you come into a process, so that you can sort of push them to the side and make decisions based on objectivity versus the biases that might exist. And I remember when I first took one of those, and it was the gender one was one of the first ones that I took, and it's about gender bias and how you view women and men in the workplace. And I remember when I got my results, because I feel like I'm one of those people that is like, women can do anything. Yes, we can. And it came back that I was actually biased against women and biased for men in workplace roles. And then I had a panic moment, like, oh my gosh, has this affected my decision-making in hiring? Has it affected my decision-making in promoting other women around me, or with salary decisions? And so I said to myself, well, and I kind of didn't believe it was true. But then as I thought more about like my relationship with my husband and what I expect from him, or what I think is true or important about our relationship, I was like, oh my gosh, this is right. But now every time I go into any of those processes, I make sure that I double check myself and my decisions based on that. So there's things like that, like as hiring managers and people in charge of these processes, that you can do to help individuals that execute processes be more equitable in their decision making and mitigating bias based on them understanding. So any other really great best practices around this that you think organizations should be considering?
I think an important thing, especially for organizations that are maybe just now starting this process and you don't have a dedicated staff person, where do you begin, I guess, is still kind of the question. And I would recommend that one place you can start is by having authentic conversations internally with your staff and understanding what the current climate is and how they view things, and recognizing that some staff, depending upon what's going on in your organization, may not feel comfortable having that conversation yet. And that's an important thing. And something that you can potentially do to kind of surface this is, if you're asking staff to have real conversations, and this is a great time, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic. People are going to let their guard down a little bit because they're struggling, potentially overstressed and overworked. They're going to probably tell you more things than they typically would in normal circumstances. So if you're going to have a conversation about race and equity, as an example, and your staff just aren't really engaged in it, they're not trying to have a conversation, that's a great telltale sign that you might need some help from the outside, or there's potentially an issue going on. So just having conversations is a great starting point.
Yeah. Thanks.
And if I could just, I just had one thing I wanted to add around the fit issue. We've made it a bad word on this call, but it's not necessarily a bad word, right? Because there is a fit. that we're looking for when we are bringing people onto our organizations. We want people, just like Antonio said, that are going to complement our culture. And that's really what you're looking for, someone that will complement your culture. And while a fit is something that's intangible, you can make it more quantifiable by defining what your organization's core values are and making that the barometer by which you measure if someone is a quote unquote fit for your organization. And if you can really set those values, then you really can begin to hire for the right cultural fit for your organization, and at the same time hire for diversity and equity. But you cannot do that until you actually define what the fit is, because then it becomes in flux and the fit becomes whatever we like in that moment, and that's when it becomes a problem. But if you can get it down to a place where you can quantify it and therefore measure it, then you can hire for fit, but you have to make sure that you define those values first.
Yeah, and I'm loving what you're saying right now. And I'm thinking about, like, if you're leading an organization and how to, the values of the organization, if you have core values or you have, beliefs or mission statements, things like that, having equity principles and behaviors as part of that is really important. Have you all seen any really good examples of organizations that have done that well, that really communicated their commitment to inclusion or commitment to equity as part of their organizational values?
Other than nonprofit HR?
Well, yeah, we do. But other than us, have you seen some good examples of that?
Yeah, and I don't want to call out specific organizations, but a telltale sign is that the employees will be familiar with those concepts, right? So if you put them on your website as an example and you put it out to the public, do your employees actually have some type of familiarity with it? Is like a litmus test there, right? If we didn't believe it about our own organization, you would know because I wouldn't know what they are. And I've been in organizations and worked with organizations to where they had phenomenal diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, but it was only with a specific subset of their employees. And then a lot of the frontline workers didn't have any clue as to what that was about. They never heard of it. And so, that's one litmus test is, are the employees actually familiar with it? And that's an easy conversation to have.
I also think it would be beneficial to ask employees, I know a lot of policies are written at organizations and missions and new initiatives are given, but I would ask an employee maybe 3 months afterwards, what have you seen us do? And if they can't speak to what they actually saw take place, maybe you did all of the great beforehand, you did all of the research, but you haven't been able to actually act it out. And I do feel that that is something I've seen in organizations where certain policies or what we consider to be a cultural norm is only a norm for the executive or leadership, but when it comes down to the people who are actually doing the work, they're like, no, I haven't seen that expressed here, but I know that it's on the website. I hear about it at meetings, but I haven't seen it yet.
So not just about what's written, but how it actually shows up in the environment is probably more important, right? And I think about, like, generationally too, like, young people don't have patience to, if it isn't lined up, peace out, right? They're not going to stick around for that. And I think the actions and making sort of those values and the environment come to life through how employees experience you is an incredibly important point. Myra, anything else to add? And I'm going to throw a tough question next because I have something really important I want y'all to talk about.
Okay, well then I'm going to defer because I don't have anything that hasn't already been said. Okay.
All right.
You're listening to The Switch. Follow along with this podcast. Download the slides and other visual materials at nonprofithr.com/The Switch.
So I know that a lot of organizations are sort of on that path to trying to diversify their organizations, especially at the highest levels of the organization. And way back when they talked about sort of the quotas, or we're going to make sure we have at least X number of, people of this diversity and all of that. And people still sort of revert back to, like, that way of thinking of diversification of leadership, right? And people will say to me, well, Emily, if we're really trying to get diverse talent, is that reverse discrimination? Like, how do we navigate sort of that conversation? So what advice do you have to organizations that are still sort of thinking about this in the old school way that really isn't how we view it anymore? It's not about getting this type of person in this seat and this many, et cetera. So how do you have that conversation with organizations that are trying to diversify their talents across their pipeline and in the leadership of their organizations?
Yeah, I'll chime in first if that's all right. And this is a big conversation. We could actually have an entire webinar just on this one topic. And when I facilitate graduate courses, it's an entire it's one night that we talk about this topic. So the first thing I'll say is that reverse discrimination doesn't really exist. and that's going to potentially confuse some of you. But if you think about the fact that there's still significant inequity in terms of how this leadership is distributed amongst demographics, we have 50-50 almost in terms of men and women in the workforce, but the majority of people at the highest levels of leadership are still men. So reverse discrimination can't exist if there's still a huge imbalance and inequity of where people are and where they can kind of attain their highest career status. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we're not endorsing quotas because quotas are illegal. From a hiring standpoint, the federal courts have determined that quotas are not an appropriate way to diversify your staff base, and we know that. And that's the great thing about having an HR consultancy is that we know what's legal, we know what's not. So what you can do is that you can set goals for diversifying your workforce. So as an example, if you want to, if you have an imbalance of men and women in your workforce, you want to increase the number of women in your workplace, you can set a goal of you want to have 15% more women in your staff base in the next 2 to 3 years. And if you don't achieve that goal, that's okay because it's a goal. It's a benchmark that you want to try for, but you don't have to get there. And maybe you'll exceed it, right? So either way that you fall in there, setting a goal is a great kind of counter to having like a fixed number to go after. So that's how we from a legal standpoint like to address these types of things, but also give you kind of a direction to go and something to strive for.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that one? Because I know a lot of HR professionals struggle with this, right? And figuring out the balance between being intentional about addressing those inequities and sort of this mindset that we have about what that means or how we go about doing it.
I think it's quite often when I ask a search committee what their timeline is, the answer is we're going to search until we get it right, until we get the right person. You know, there's no real deadline. We want to search until we get it right, which is the perfect answer. I love hearing that. But what they don't understand is that to me, that means until we have a diverse pipeline of people to be considered for this role, we cannot possibly have gotten it right. And if everyone begins to just make that one small change when you are beginning your next hiring process, that when you're looking at the pipeline of candidates that you have, who you are considering and who you are interested in for this role, if to the best of your knowledge, based upon what you can tell with the materials that have been submitted, if your pipeline is not diverse, then you haven't gotten it right yet. It means that you need to keep looking. The four of us are here today to tell you that the diverse talent 100% is out there, okay? So if you haven't found it, it's because you legitimately just haven't found it yet. It's not because it isn't out there. And it really means that you just need to keep looking. And when you find the people that you're looking for, start a distribution list for what was the source that this resume came in from. Do some research on the demographics of professionals that frequent whatever that publication happened to be. And you want to make sure that it's a place that you continue to advertise your positions in. You want to make sure with LinkedIn, 90% of the profiles also have a picture. And you can look right there and see who you are recruiting. While all pictures are not going to be an accurate depiction of someone's gender, ethnic, or other cultural background, you still can begin to see generally how your pipeline is shaping up. And if it isn't diverse, you haven't gotten it right yet. And it's just quite simply that you have to keep searching until you have a diverse pipeline.
Agreed. And if you don't have a diverse pipeline, you have zero chance of meeting any of those targets to address inequities, right? So it starts there with really getting the pipeline in a good place. And I also love what you said about, sometimes we need somebody in the job yesterday and we're just going to hurry up and get it done and find that person. But really slowing down that decision making and slowing down that process can help you take the time you need to get that and to be able to do that. Sophia, did you want to weigh in at all on this one? What do you think?
So I definitely wanted to say one of the things I wrote down when you first asked the question was definitely the candidate pool. So Myra hit it right there. If your candidate pool is looking not diverse, keep going. But to also bring in some practical things that you can do that doesn't feel like you're trying to hit some quota that feels like it's being biased or anything of that nature is kind of piggybacking on what Antonio said. Say you want to increase the women that are represented in your leadership team by 15%. I think it's responsible of employers to know that you can train your your current employee staff in a way that will develop them into supervision. There's nothing wrong with a manager in training role or manager in training type of boot camp program where 15 different people or 10 different people are specifically trained to do a management type role that you all have open, and then you promote from within. And so we're not saying that you have to go get 15% of women or diverse candidates from outside of your organization. You can get that 15% from within your organization, which also shows that you're bringing your leadership with you and you're allowing your current people to actually go to a higher rank and level and be able to attain more through that leadership. So I think that's something that people could take into perspective, especially from the expense, which is something we think about, right? Retaining and attracting client. We don't want people just continually leaving. So a way to keep your employees is to keep them trained, keep them developed, and keep them moving up from within.
Yeah, and I love that. And so attracting talent doesn't mean always from the outside. It means knowing your talent inside and developing that pipeline. I love that. And I think today's topic is not about succession planning. We could spend some time talking about that within itself. And oftentimes when I work with organizations, they don't have a process or a plan for succession planning. And we all know what happens when you don't have a process or plan for that, right? It's whoever has been pulled close to the hiring managers that gets promoted, and not allowing for sort of the look at the entire talent picture in an organization. And so what you just shared is incredibly important, and thinking about how, as an HR leader, are you going to understand the talent pool you have, cultivate that talent pool so that you also have wonderful internal candidates that compete with wonderful external candidates for you all to get the right people for these positions. So I love that. And Alicia, you're here because we have a good question, so I'm going to let you ask.
We actually have a number of follow-up questions about getting a diverse pipeline. Several people asked what types of job postings, sites, and such would you recommend to be able to get a more diverse pipeline?
Professional organizations, I think, is a great first, very easy reach. You have National Association of Black Engineers that tells you exactly where you're getting it. You have an Asian American Association. It could be social workers, right? So that tells you immediately what you're going to get in that understanding of changing the cultural norm that you might already have within your organization. So there are professional organizations. You know that the people that are there either have some kind of experience or degree or some type of education background that is specifically focused on what you want. And then you also know that they are diverse. And also, just because they may be a part of an Asian American association, understand that for professional organizations, you may have more than just an Asian background. You might also have a Black and Hispanic background, but you are allowed to be in these organizations or join up with these organizations because that is what you identify with. And I think that's the other thing that we have to think about in DEI is respecting how people identify, because that is important.
Yeah, definitely. And that great points, Sophia. Just yesterday, actually, the question internally is we're trying to help client is, do we have any experience with, I believe it was ocean sciences? So, it was a very specific background. And, I'm sure people are probably like, I've never had experience in looking for someone that has an ocean sciences background. But I found 3 organizations in about 10 minutes that specifically focused on diverse cultivation of scientists in that specific field. And they're in 3 different parts of the country. So, hey, you got 3 places in 10 minutes, and it didn't take me long to find them. So the real answer is that they're out there. You just have to spend a little bit of time doing some research, understanding what organizations exist. Like Sophia mentioned a number of them. There's thousands and thousands of professional organizations that can get you professionals of any level of experience, either beginning of the career. Those are probably even more abundant these days, but you can definitely, through their alumni networks, get additional people that are more experienced and might be more in line with what you're actually looking for.
Yeah, and I would also say too, like I think about when I was in operations and nonprofits and we were like grassroots in the community. I would often too, it wasn't about a website, it was about going to places where people gather in the community and talking about, hey, can I have a few minutes to get on your agenda to talk about some openings and opportunities that I have? Or, going to churches in the communities and sharing the job posting with key influencers in those spaces, right? So also too, if you're looking for candidates that reflect community, guess what? Get out of your office, get off your computer and go into the community and talk about the opportunity to work with your organization and know who the key influencers are in the community that will be willing to be ambassadors to you to expand your recruiting pools based on not just who's in your organization, but who knows your community well. And if you begin to build that trust and relationship, you'll get a lot of candidates coming to you from referrals from places all through the community, which will help you to do that on a very grassroots level as well. So we tend to go to like posting on LinkedIn or sites, but at the end of the day, community development is empowering the community to solve its own challenges and issues and getting the community to be a part of our teams to help us to do that, right? So that's the other piece of it that I would add. Myra, anything else from your end?
Do not post and pray. You cannot post and pray because you're allowing the universe to make your organization's decisions on diverse recruitment. I mean, there's no way, you can't control that. You're really just relying on what comes in. And that's not something that we have done. It's not something that we advise our clients to do. And you really just have to be intentional about fixing any issues you have around a diverse workforce. People are saying all the time that there are no diverse executives available, or at any different level. We are proud to boast at Nonprofit HR that 85% of our placements in executive search have been women and or people of color. And we have been able to achieve those results by picking up the phone, calling people, speaking to past placements. Who do you know in your network? Actually talking to professional associations about their affinity groups, because some of the associations have smaller groups within them of affinity groups that they connect you to and their listservs. So you really just have to be intentional about it. It's about being direct. It's about going and flooding the market with what you have. And when you speak to people about it, people will pick up on your desire to really diversify, and they'll become champions and sponsors for your organization in the marketplace and will continually say, hey, this organization is making a concerted effort to diversify leadership. I really think you should just keep up with them and see what's going on.
This event was originally recorded as a nonprofit HR webinar. Check out other nonprofit HR events and virtual learning opportunities at nonprofithr.com/events.
So we actually are running on the end of the time for the panel. So I just want to give you all just one sort of last word piece. Like, what advice do you have for our listeners out there that want to, really get on that equity journey as it relates to attracting talent and bringing talent into the organizations? Like, if you had one, like, start here, or this is the best practice, what piece of advice would you leave them with today?
Something that's very important to me with any role that I have and any client that I am working to assist, any organization I'm working with, is accountability. I think that it's great to have a plan, to set things in place, to take initiative to do things. But if you don't set any type of metric or just some type of qualitative and quantitative data to look back at and see, have we progressed in 3 months? Have we progressed in 6 months? Have we progressed in 9 months? Then you're not really holding your organization and your leadership to be accountable for what you stated. And I think accountability is something that every person should be about.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll add to that and say that you should have an understanding of where you currently are with your organization's diversity, especially as it relates to the people you're serving. So if you can look internally and very quickly identify that you're not a very diverse organization staff-wise, that's an initial place to be in, because now you have kind of that foundational concrete knowledge. Now, for those organizations that maybe aren't sure and they're looking for a partner, we can do equity assessments within organizations to get a deep dive of, we'll look at employee demographics, we'll get some employee attitudes through surveys, we can conduct focus groups to really peel back what's happening within your organization. So if you're interested in those types of really deep dives and say, I'm not necessarily sure where we're at, I think we might be okay, but we just don't know, we want to find out, an external partner and an audit can definitely help you with that. And maybe don't view it as an audit so much as more of just trying to understand where you're at when it comes to the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there are definitely formalized processes to get answers to that question.
Thank you. Myra, close us out.
I think what I would really say is just get started and don't be afraid to ask for help. It's a very touchy subject. It's hard to admit that we have some of the issues, especially when some of them are glaring. Those are the hardest ones to really admit to. Give yourself some grace and recognize that by asking for help, you're already moving in the right direction. And don't stop until you have achieved the culture and the equitable workforce that you set out to attain, and just keep going. Be as dogmatic about achieving an equitable workplace and culture as you are about moving the needle on your mission, because recognize that you will never be able to make as much of an impact for the mission that your organization serves without first addressing these issues. So you're already falling down on your mission if you don't address it.
Thank you. And don't leave that, everybody. We have a little bit more for you. We're going to give some tips here, and then we'll come back at the end and potentially address some more questions then. So we'll get to the next piece here, because I know all of you are just saying, hey, how do I really go about attracting a diverse talent pool? And I'm going to give you some tips too around hiring. So we talked a lot about it today. You heard from the panel of things that you can do. And my takeaways are just go where the diverse talent already is and recruit in places and spaces where diverse talent is already existing. And we talked about affiliation groups. We talked about key community relationships and community groups where diverse talent exists. And so you want to make sure that you're casting a wide net. And I also always tell organizations that if you keep doing your recruiting the same way you've always done it and keep getting the same results you've always gotten, we shouldn't be surprised by that. And so how can you think about different and unique ways to expand how you're attracting and how you're recruiting? And at the end of the day, also understanding what your past employees and current employees are projecting out about you as it relates to who you are as an employer. So one other very important thing you could do right now is just Google your organization, go on Glassdoor and check out how your organization is being talked about and viewed. And if you're finding things that are surprising to you or finding things that you don't like, being able to utilize that data to help make a plan to be able to shift how your culture is actually showing up to your employees and former employees that allows you to project the leadership brand that you potentially do. But Myra said it earlier, if you don't spend time attracting diverse talent into your pipeline and having diverse slates of candidates for all of your openings, you'll have no chance of being able to diversify leadership. And Sophia shared too that it's not just about attracting outside talent, it's about really understanding who's inside your organization and cultivating them to be ready to move into leadership roles and having those paths for development within your own organization. And I talk to leaders all the time where I say to them, you know, you have all these frontline leaders. Do you know what they bring to the table, what their backgrounds are, what they do as their side job? That might be something that positions them really well to do something else with your organization. We tend to, once we get people into our org, we forget to have conversations about that with them, about what they're passionate about, what they've been doing, what they now just went to school to be able to do, et cetera, and be able to cultivate that. I just also wanted to share some questions that you all just can take these and begin to use them. And I talked about some of them before, but you know, asking the employees and asking your team, how would you rate your organization's employment brand or your image? And how are you going to figure out the answer to that question if you don't know? Former employees are a great source of information. And I know sometimes once we exit employees out of our organization, you know, if we give them an exit interview, that's one piece of data, but also then checking in to see those sites that will tell us sort of what people's experience have been in our organization. And it's really important. And I think now more than ever, you know, communities and stakeholders are holding organizations accountable to what it feels like to be in an organization. And, you know, social media is a place that you can get some of that great information about what it has felt like for people that have left your organization. What does your website say? We talked about this earlier. Most people will not even apply for something until they've at least went and looked at the website and done some searching. And so that's an important place to start. And then, have you been talking to the team members that exist on your team from some of those underrepresented groups that you're looking to grow and cultivate, how it feels to work at their organization? Would they recommend it to your peers in their circle, yes or no? And having some of those types of conversations with individuals that are currently in your organization is really important, to create that sort of feedback and environment where people feel that their opinions are valued and that there aren't repercussions for them telling you the truth about how they're feeling and how they're experiencing the organization, but it can give you some really great data. And then lastly, I would say, have you conducted an equity audit on your HR systems and processes to clearly understand where bias might be present? And again, Antonio shared, we here at Nonprofit HR are here for you if you need a partner in that. But I think at the end of the day, you should be doing things like compensation reviews. You should be doing things like taking a look at your retention numbers and saying, are people of certain groups retained at different rates than others, and why, and what's causing that? So understanding your data and using data to make decisions and strategic changes is important. And the HR systems and processes is a place often where inequities creep in. So you need to be asking yourself those types of questions and understanding what your data picture can tell you. So lastly, we talked about that the interview process is a spot where oftentimes when we're talking with organizations, bias just gets right in there. And so I did want to leave you all with just some tangible ways to mitigate or interrupt bias in your interviewing processes. So first, we talked about this earlier, that you have to recognize that we as individuals, everyone has bias. It's just how our brains are wired. You'll have to believe me, but the science behind it is we take in so much information each day that we don't slow down enough to be able to process each piece of information. So our brain just takes these shortcuts to help us move through life because of all the inputs that come in. And what that process in our brain does is cause us to make mistakes potentially based on the speed of the information. And those snap judgments often translate into our behaviors, our decisions, and things that impact our organizations, because the decisions and choices of people who have bias is what makes up organizations, and it introduces bias into organizations and systems. So we just have to recognize that it's there and understand that it's something that we need to be looking for and paying attention to. The second piece is being intentional with process. And the group talked about this a little bit, but if you don't have a consistent interview process that is followed throughout your organization, bias is going to be creeping in based on just inconsistency alone. And so once you decide on your process, have a few people put their eyes on it and help you see what you're not seeing. And then you must execute that process with intention and building in things like ensuring that we educate panelists who are interviewing on bias and having them reflect and think about that, building in things like ensuring there's a rubric for each candidate to be reviewed on versus us just only having a conversation about how we felt about the person, etc. So building into your process things that are going to help you interrupt and mitigate bias throughout, and then running that process consistently for the employees that are coming into your organization. The third one is about slowing down decisions. I know in nonprofits, we oftentimes are hiring because we needed the person last week, right? But we really want to take time to slow down decisions, slow down processes so that you can be intentional with your process by slowing down and making sure all pieces are taken. But then also as we give ourselves time to reflect on decisions and bring other people with differing perspectives into the conversation, and slowing down and taking time to do that helps us to make more informed and less biased decisions. And so slowing down is incredibly important. The next thing is just encouraging your panels to challenge the dominant ways of thinking. And, we talked about that idea of fit, right, as part of this conversation. And so we want to make sure that we're allowing our interview panelists to come with their perspectives and to challenge groups by saying, well, I know that's how we've always done it, but why? Why have we done it that way? And do we need to have a person just like that? Or can we expand and bring somebody in who has a very different view of this thing? You'll want to set up environments where that is allowed, that it isn't just about people coming in and shaking their heads and going through a process. It's about having dialogue that's going to allow us to challenge what maybe has always been, which will help us break out of some of that bias that may be existing in the process. And the last thing is just really important. Only judge what is critical to the topic at hand. And as part of interviewing, like this is not just a nice to have, like it's a legal thing that we need to be not asking certain types of questions about background and demographics or family status during interviews. But what I'm thinking about more is when we're thinking about candidates and we're deciding who's going to move on or not, is this thing critical to the person being successful in the job? Should we be having these conversations? And that's where the rubric really comes in, by setting up what we're going to be holding people accountable to or judging people by is what is really required to do the job. And I've been in processes where I've been having the debrief conversation and someone will say something like, well, what if so-and-so has another kid and then maybe they can't do X, Y, Z? And I'll be like, whoa, time out. That person having another kid has nothing to do with them being able to do the job. And so holding the team accountable to those conversations and making sure that we're only judging judging what is critical at hand based on what needs to happen for that person to be successful in the job. So it's hard to do, but we need to set up those accountability pieces so that we check each other when we slip back into sort of human nature of talking about all the humanity pieces around fit and around culture and around people. And with just a couple minutes left, and we are going to take some more questions here at the end, but I encourage everyone that's listening to say, okay, you spent this 90 minutes with us, so what? What part of the conversation really was important for you? What potentially will you do differently based on something that was shared today? And just really making the commitment to say, I'm going to take one or two things that I heard from the panel today and infuse that into my leadership brand and help equity become a part of how I operate as a nonprofit leader and with my teams. And so, all of you, I hope, are just thinking about, what does this mean for you? What will you do differently based on what was shared today?
Well, that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. The Switch, featuring nonprofit HR's DEI practice. Does your organization need to talk with someone about the topics we covered today? Nonprofit HR's DEI practice is your thought partner for all diversity, equity, and inclusion needs. Our firm has served the social sector exclusively for more than 20 years. Call us 202-785-2060 or email us for a mini consult. info@nonprofithr.com. Looking for more episodes of The Switch? Visit nonprofithr.com/The Switch and access recordings and resources to help your organization maximize its greatest asset, your people.